Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this conversation on Edge. This is part of a report, Getting Edgy, from Senza Fili in collaboration with FierceWireless. And we're going to talk today about why do we need the Edge in the first place? Why is it such a hot topic recently? And I'm talking today with Yves Boudreau. He is the VP of Partnerships and Ecosystem Strategy at Ericsson. Yves, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
So that's a really hot topic, Edge, these days. Can you tell us what is that you do at Ericsson on this?
Sure. I look after the ecosystem strategy partnerships, which is a fancy way of saying that every day I work with various companies who essentially are looking for creative ways to launch their applications or parts of their applications at the edge of the network. And what that really means is getting closer to eyeballs or eyeball networks. Those eyeball networks are owned by our service provider customers who then become partners in the UDN ecosystem.
So what is UDN, first of all?
UDN is actually a network. So UDN stands for Unified Delivery Network. It's a program that was started within Ericsson about 2 to 3 years ago. And ultimately, it's our attempt at creating an environment for our service provider customers to pool network resources together to go build an edge computing and CDN in conjunction with each other. So Ericsson's made its own investments in the network that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's essentially a network today.
Okay, that's very good. And so let's get started from sort of like square one. Why is Edge important? You know, when we're trying to get everything in the cloud, everything it's global, everything it's everywhere. So why are we going back to the Edge, so to say?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if you look at the internet and how things got started years ago, it's really an issue of scalability and performance. More and more traffic and applications are moving from private networks onto the public internet. CDNs are a great example of how the internet was able to scale not only for web page downloads and for video, but distributing that content closer to the networks just makes it easier for overall networks, internet, interconnects, and different last mile networks to actually scale more elegantly as more traffic essentially starts traversing those networks.
Yeah, so it's simplicity, it makes sense, but it's also what is there for the users?
Well, the users themselves, as they continue to move more of their traffic and applications onto internet. So for example, if you look at a traditional television network, whether it's a broadcast network or a paid television service, those are really on private networks. Now, more and more of those services are going over the top. So if you look at Hulu, Netflix, Google, all of these services essentially are not necessarily riding those private networks. And essentially they're going over the public internet, not only in the first mile and middle mile, but also in the last mile. Networks themselves. So as more and more of that traffic pours into the internet, as opposed to being controlled by last mile service providers, we need a way to scale that traffic, right? So there's an estimate at this stage that about 5% of viewing time actually is going over the internet. Well, what do we do when the next 5% or the next 25%, or we get to the tipping point of majority of traffic goes over the internet? We need a way to scale that traffic, not only for web pages, but more specifically for large object video, to make sure that the experience that people have on private networks is equivalent or better when that traffic flows over to the internet.
And yeah, and so scalability is clearly an issue, but it's sort of complicated by the fact that the service providers do not own the content. So it's not that the service provider on its own can address the issue. So the service provider has to work with the content providers, the over-the-top players, application developers, and traditionally that has been a sort of a difficult relationship.
It has. If you look at, I would say, most service providers today, many of them actually have television offerings. Now, ironically enough, those service offerings were done in partnership with, take HBO, for example, where HBO would essentially bring their signal into the service provider and then hand it off, and the service provider would then be the distributor of HBO in those particular cases. The shift that's happened now is, as these companies try and go global, they've decided to actually go into the business to consumer market, so B2C in these cases, and offering discrete a la carte offerings of an HBO channel less as part of a pay TV bundle and more specifically as an HBO Go or an HBO Now type of a service direct to consumers. And those mean that there are new technologies that are required in order to deliver that service. So before the distributor took care of that technology, now HBO needs to take care of that technology. And the trend is more B2C, not less B2C, and that's globally for all of these OTT providers. And what that means is that they need a way to scale. They're moving that traffic off the walled garden networks, the private networks, the last mile networks that these service providers operate, and moving them onto the internet. So as that traffic shifts, more growth opportunity for them in the business market in general, but also more challenges for the service providers. And so what we're trying to do is bridge that gap and help those service providers partake, let's say, in that business model, which is a new one, where they are no longer the distributor or the sole distributor of that content, but also still have that traffic going onto their network, largely unmonetized.
And so you need to find a way to align the expectations, desires, and so you need to make sure that everybody is comfortable. So as you mentioned, it's a new business model that you're trying to promote. Can you tell us about how does that work?
Well, traditionally today, when you look at, and I'll use HBO as the example here, just to be consistent, but HBO that wants to deliver content within the operator network over the top typically would have to go and get a CDN in order to do that. Which means that those CDNs are distributed, but still highly centralized in terms of number of locations. So typically CDN providers don't deploy equipment inside the operator network and typically don't pay the operator to deliver that content. The business really has always been about saving bandwidth and trying to figure out a way to scale the network, but not necessarily in partnership with the service provider in a meaningful way. So what we've tried to do is pool together a number of operators. I think we're up to about mid-80s now operators who've agreed to install caching infrastructure inside of their network. And the business model for us is we actually take that capacity to market on their behalf in a global way, and then give them a significant revenue share of the revenue that our sales team will essentially recoup from sales of that capacity to the content provider community.
So this is quite interesting and new, because oftentimes the operators, mobile operators, look at monetization as something that comes from the subscribers. So
yes,
this monetization is charging subscribers more, and it's a strategy that's not working all that well, especially in markets like the US or Europe. So what you're doing is to move it to have the content providers to contribute. But that's also something that operators have been traditionally a little bit skeptical in terms of getting that. How can you convince the content providers to contribute, which seems fair because they're getting an advantage there? Are they finally willing to step and pay?
Yeah, the question comes in the form a lot of, why now, right? Or what's changed? And, in a lot of these cases, we're looking for compelling events, but in some cases right now, this has just been elapsed time, right? So if we would have had this conversation 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had the same answer, but there's been plenty of time has passed. The over-the-top services are now legitimate, businesses. I mean, it's not this is not going to catch on anymore, or this will be very small. Everybody knows that YouTube and Netflix and Hulu are go-to places for entertainment now. And I think a lot of the service providers not only have embraced that now, whereas opposed to in the past, maybe they would not have embraced it, but they're all very familiar that the internet has offered increased competition. Some people may call it disintermediation, but it's increased competition, selection for consumers. It's all good for consumers, but it does put some of our traditional service provider customers in a different situation of having to, work on different terms of not having large, non-competitive, vertically integrated services with very little competition. But I think they've all done a really nice job so far of embracing that. But the elapsed time has really kind of helped get people to understand, okay, this is the way it's going to be going forward. How do we then create a different environment that's going to embrace this as opposed to a defensive strategy, which maybe would be a little bit difficult for them to accept.
Now, you have many content providers as partners, and can you? But they're clearly the ones we know, they're, big companies. How do you deal with making sure that the smaller content providers also have access to the same network?
Yeah, so we don't actually tell people whether they can or cannot ride the network. If somebody comes back and says we have content we'd like to distribute and we can come to a commercial agreement to do that, then this is for big or small. This is accessible to pretty much anybody. And multi-CDN is actually something that over the last 3 years has really become a reality for these guys. So there is now choice not only for the subscribers in terms of the services, but there's also choice for the content providers in terms of how they carry their traffic and scale their networks.
So it could be some local
Yep.
content provider, and
Yep.
there'll be
Yep.
no difference as long as they have, the willingness to get into an agreement with you.
That's right. In fact, one of the things that's still alive and well and still kind of a part of the legacy environment is the content rights and distribution windows that the studios and various content providers have. So in a lot of these cases, there are, if you look at the top 10 providers, you'll see all the usual suspects in there in terms of who is on the network. But in each of the countries, there's 2 or 3 in the top 10 that are really regional providers offering content or applications that are very specific to that country or very specific to a part of that country. And so those have been a big target of us as well as we look at strategic areas to go build out the footprint with those service providers in mind.
So back to the business model. So the content providers have, for them, it's an OpEx model. They would just be paying as they go along.
Yep.
So who pays for the infrastructure?
It's actually a split. So typically, Ericsson would sell technology to a service provider, and those service providers would launch those technologies and go create services around them. In this particular case, we've invested ourselves. We felt it was quite important in support of our service provider customer base that we've had for well over 100 years, that we actually put some money into this as well. And so we've invested in our core network in 22 locations. We've also invested in a sales force, a global sales force, to take this capacity to market on behalf of our service provider partners. And in some cases, we've actually invested in the edge network as well in order to get people started, to basically remove roadblocks, for budgeting or for deployment. And then the operators are investing as well in different parts of the edge network as a whole. But ultimately, I think it's been a big step forward for us to demonstrate our commitment to these partnerships by investing in our own CapEx and OpEx to get this started and to grow it as quickly as we have in the last 18 months.
Well, that's interesting. Is this sort of part of a different way to do business as an equipment vendor to sort of to promote the deployment by basically changing the business model from your end as well?
Yeah, we think it is. It's something that we have done in the past as well. There's a few other programs that are very similar to UDN within the company, which kind of follow the same set of principles. But yeah, it is a little bit different as traditional equipment vendors. We've realized that we actually have to change the way we do business as well. We've gotten plenty of feedback from our service provider customers and some of our content provider customers that we need to make these changes. And so we have support from them to do that. And yeah, it is definitely a different model for us.
Now, you talk about a share UDN. What is that? What is being shared specifically here?
Yeah, so in this particular case, we've got a very high number of service providers who actually have their own digital properties or their own over-the-top content properties. Some of them have come up with agreements with traditional global CDNs to carry that content. Others have launched their own CDN technologies and realized that the CDN technology market moves very quickly. And so what we've offered to them is what we call a shared CDN model, where we do what we would typically do in terms of giving them the platform to run on. But ultimately, we reserve some capacity not only to run their own traffic, but to run some of the traffic from other UDN content provider customers on that same infrastructure. So it essentially becomes a shared infrastructure that they can run their own services on, but also still be open to the more public UDN customer base to run their traffic on as well. So we think it's a unique model that seems to be gaining traction with those with our service provider customers that have other digital properties or OTT services that they want to run in their network alongside some of the other traditional UDN customers.
So now that's interesting. But when we talk about offering service and managing traffic, there is also another level, which is the service provider would optimize service, would give different priorities. And so what is it the service provider does and what is it the content provider does? For instance, if you have video, in terms of optimizing the video experience, who is going to be responsible for that?
Mm-hmm. Right now, there's no prioritization or optimizations per se in the network. I think that most have agreed that they're going to, respect the spirit of the various countries' net neutrality positions. So there's no real prioritization, if you will. Ironically enough, in some of the markets, if they wanted to prioritize traffic, they can now, but nobody seems to be going in that particular direction. In this case, we're running under the same provisions as most people have given to CDNs. Which is essentially just the laws of physics. If you're able to place infrastructure closer to the eyeballs, the actual proximity of the device itself without any real prioritization is enough to help scale performance and reduce latencies just from a physical geography standpoint. So that's what most of them have done so far. They have not been prioritizing, if you will, traffic from a network standpoint.
But what about optimizing the content itself, so that depending on like for instance things like the screen size of the devices, or for instance a problem that sometimes there is that because the content is all encrypted,
Mm-hmm.
Operators do not know that it's video, so they don't know how to process it properly. Not to give priority to one content provider over the other, but to make sure that the traffic is carried in the proper way.
Yeah, in this particular case, there's nothing special that they're doing, at least today. They're treating all that traffic with the same level of priority to make sure that everybody has fair access to that last mile. In the future, that may change, but all of the negotiation in terms of higher bit rates, higher or lower resolutions is still all controlled between the caching servers themselves and the clients that are actually making those determinations on network heuristics and whether or not they can go to a higher or lower bit rate. Now, what we have seen with some of our deployments is that as the latencies get significantly lower, say from 60 or 80 milliseconds down to 15 or 20, those higher bit rates are actually able to be carried in the last mile network, as opposed to if they were delivered much more centrally, especially in remote countries where connectivity is poor. So our hope is that as people shy away from launching, virtual reality or ultra high definition or 4K services that never get to the 10 or 15 or 20 megabits that are required to deliver those services, that reduction in latency will actually afford those subscribers the opportunity to get to those higher bit rates and consume higher bit rate services, either directly to their devices or to their television sets.
Now, where is your infrastructure? Where does it sit? Because the question is always, where is the edge? It's not at the base station and it's not a central location. Where is it?
Typically, we start within the operator's network in high-level peering points, and then we actually distribute, one level deeper. So depending on what type of operator you're talking about, whether it's a telco or a cable operator or a fiber operator, and the network topology that they have, you can go very, very deep into the network. So for example, in a cable operator's environment, in some of the more mature markets, if you will, their homes passed are very low in the hundreds of subscribers. And you could place caching infrastructure that deep. We're not doing that today. It's not really required, but as you scale the traffic, you can move deeper and deeper into the infrastructure edge of those operators. But as we start with some of the operators, we're starting anywhere between 3 to 20 different locations. In some cases, we're looking into 40 different locations. But it really scales with the amount of traffic and where the actual consumer consumption ends up being. So with the analytics that we provide to those service providers to understand where the traffic is going, they can then do network planning and cache planning to push further and further into the operator network itself. On the mobile side of things, you're right. It's a highly centralized environment in some of these deployments. As we move to 5G, that IP edge will move closer to the base station. And the same kind of traffic engineering rules apply wherever those eyeballs are and wherever the traffic is, and wherever you can get relief on the network and improve performance is where those caches essentially will go.
Yeah, and so that's interesting because so the edge is moving towards getting closer to the end user, and we might expect that to happen even more as we move, as you mentioned, to 5G. So maybe let's talk about what else can you do with the edge infrastructure, because obviously, CDN, that's a clear step one. That's yes. Obviously, video is so much of our content, but what other applications do you see becoming relevant?
Yeah. Well, CDN is a great edge application that people understand. I don't think anybody really needs to sit around and debate whether or not, what a CDN is, how, what the technology drivers are, how people buy and sell CDN. So it was a great first application. But that's exactly what it is. It is a first application. And as we've been talking to more and more partners that see what we're building, CDN runs on top of the edge platform that we have, but it can host additional applications. And we've looked at the gaming industry for gaming acceleration. We have a few partners there that we're working with now actively that are onboarded and doing tests and trials with some of our service providers. We've looked at the ultra low latency market for live television as well. Still CDN-like, but technology itself that can run on an edge platform as opposed to having to be installed in all these different locations as a unique application or a monolithic kind of an application. We've looked at the enterprise market. There was a press release recently from a partner from a company called Mode, which is going after the enterprise market. They believe that there is acceleration and reliability opportunities for enterprise customers to run their applications as well. And we looked at the mobile acceleration space with a few partners there as well. The unique, let's say, characteristic of all those applications is that they all see value in executing their application in part or in whole at the edge of an operator network in partnership with them. It really is around acceleration and performance, but it's also around data sovereignty as well. So when we talk about smart cities or healthcare or any kind of government applications that have very strict rules on where data can be stored, processed, and where it traverses, in some of these cases, it has to be in a very specific geography. And so one of the beauties of the 500, 600 service providers globally is that's what they have. They have presence in country with physical addresses that can guarantee that data is staying in a particular physical location. And it's one of those unique kind of value propositions that if pooled together, operators can actually offer that value to the market from a data sovereignty standpoint.
Yes, and I think that's an interesting point because a lot of the value of having everything local, for instance, for a security point of view, or because you don't just need to go back to the internet, but at the same time there is a need to put everything as sort of it's a global game at the same time. And so how can you balance both of them?
It's a delicate balance, as you can imagine. I don't think we have all the answers in those cases right now, but as we talk more and more to people and they give us an idea of what they can and cannot do, then we can strike the balance based on the information that they give us.
And now, like, if you think about gaming, clearly that is a case where latency is so important that you want to be as close to the user as you possibly can.
Yes.
But at the same time, when you play with people that are wherever on Earth. So that's again, it's a global. You might be playing with everybody anywhere. How can you combine that? It's like so you have a local local component, but also you need to communicate with these other players. How do you manage that?
Well, in this case, I think it's important for people to understand, this concept of first mile, middle mile, and last mile. The last mile in this particular case is really the service provider's domain. The first mile, it really ends up being wherever you're originating game server traffic in this particular case. And then the middle mile is everybody's favorite part, which is you have no idea where that traffic is going in between. And so some of these gaming acceleration technology companies, one in particular is based in my hometown of Atlanta called Haste. And the way that they've combated this particular problem is by trying to address essentially challenges in the first, middle, and last mile. They have a PC client that runs on a user's computer, if you will, that essentially originates the connections out to the public internet in a very creative way that then gives those users a pseudo fast lane to the gaming servers, which essentially are in that first mile. And what we provide for them is not only the ability to execute their application at the edge of the network, to make that last mile connectivity very reliable and quick, but they ride the private UDN MPLS core network in the middle mile to reconnect all the way to those first mile gaming servers. So as more and more traffic from consoles and PC games and mobile games, the multiplayer stuff, which is really sensitive to the lag, as they call it, or the latencies involved, as those connections get better and as the footprint of the client software and the network edges starts carrying more of the acceleration technology, the overall user gameplay experience is significantly improved. And what the Haste guys and some other competitors of theirs have realized is people are willing to pay for that from a consumer standpoint. And so we're very happy to be working with these types of companies and showing them the value of the edge and the value of partnering with service providers to improve consumer services. And then same thing in terms of doing the revenue share, making sure that the operators have an opportunity not only to take that type of unique, let's say, offering to market, but also partake in the revenue that they typically would not have had an opportunity to partake in.
Now, this is interesting because as you do that, as you develop this kind of partnerships, you also have a situation where the company developing the games might be developing their games in a different way because they have the infrastructure.
That's
so
right.
It's kind of like it's a loop here that might also lead to a better way to design the applications in the first place, right?
Yep. Multiplayer gaming is probably one of the large compelling events that the gaming industry, some have adopted and some have not, right? There are still some, hardcore companies that build games that are just single player games where, it's you versus the environment, as opposed to multiplayer games, which have really gotten into not only the realm of social community and playing with your friends, but now has become a legitimate business, right? Esports is not something that people are ignoring anymore. Not only are they playing the games competitively, but people are watching them play competitively. And so when you look at compelling events, the multiplayer game esports is something that is real. Service provider customers of ours investing in esports teams and the content that they provide as well. So a new phenomenon essentially that kind of has come out of nowhere that's really been afforded by connectivity of internet, both mobile and fixed, that's created a whole brand new industry that people are embracing, which we think is quite interesting. So anything we can do to help accelerate the experience there and get more people, playing, watching in a way that helps them socialize is kind of what we're quite excited about.
Excellent. Let me ask you a final question. How is edge computing or a platform like UDN push forward wireless and wireline convergence?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that it pushes convergence per se. What's pushing convergence to me is network consolidation. So in the future, what you're going to see is most operators, in my opinion, have a fixed and mobile kind of a play for their subscribers, mostly because people are demanding it. So whether it's through a formal network that they own or an MVNO, most service providers going forward will have a mobile and fixed network, and it'll be up to them and companies like ours in our traditional business to see how we actually converge that from a technology standpoint to make sure that the CapEx and OpEx that they're spending not only delivers value to the end customer, but also means that they're not operating 10 different networks with 10 different technologies. So that's our play. But in terms of what it means for cloud convergence, when we talk about the edge network itself, right, we're not trying to displace public cloud. Ultimately, what public cloud has done for the industry, both over the top and for application developers and consumers, is really kind of created new applications that did not exist before. And as the UDN tries to grow the edge compute network or the edge cloud market, as we try and create this new vertical of the market called edge cloud, we ask application providers to stay with their public cloud providers. But is there a part of their application that they can just remove that is latency sensitive, requires performance, or has some data sovereignty considerations? Can they move those applications or parts of their application to the edge of the network and improve their business? But one of the things that we do challenge them on is, does the edge create something new for your application that then creates a new application, a new environment, or new businesses or services essentially that were not possible before? So if I was to go to a large enterprise 10 years ago and tell them that they were going to run parts of their application in somebody else's data center, and that, oh, by the way, we're going to put those applications on the public internet, they probably would have, been a little concerned or maybe even laughed me out of the room. And so what we're really trying to do is create this new segment of edge cloud in partnership with our service provider customers that will enable new applications and industries. And I tell you, I meet with startups every day who are very excited about what we're doing, and they've got some very, very interesting ideas, some which will not catch on, I'm sure, but all it takes is a few, and that market will be solidified. And we're happy and excited to be a part of that and creating something new with our service provider customers and these new application people.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's a whole different way of thinking about the way you develop and build applications and what might work. So Yves, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
No problem. Thank you so much for having us.
And thank you all for watching this conversation. It was part of a report, Getting Edgy, by Senza Fili Consulting and FierceWireless. Thank you all.